Hello. During VBS, the Shiloh AME Zion clergy and I took turns talking about the miracle story assigned to that session. One of my stories was that of Peter walking on the water. And you remember the story. After feeding the 5,000 who followed him into the wilderness, Jesus commands the disciples to head across the sea without him, while he remains on shore to send the crowds on their way and then spend some time in communion with his Father on the mountain. While the disciples are crossing, a storm comes up that threatens to overwhelm them. They spend the better part of an anxious night navigating the waves, and in the early hours of the morning, Jesus strides across the water to meet them. Well, mistaking Jesus for a wave-walking specter, the disciples grow even more alarmed as he draws near. In response, Jesus reassures them that it is he who is coming to them. His encouragement works, and then some, as Peter is emboldened to ask if he might join Jesus out on the water. At first confident, since Jesus says, "Come on," Peter soon remembers the height of the waves and the depth of the sea and loses heart. Whereupon Jesus reaches out and grabs him. While Jesus remarks on his lack of faith, it's at this moment that the disciples see Jesus, as if for the first time, confessing, "Truly you are the Son of God." Which is interesting when you think about it. Jesus had just fed thousands upon thousands of helpless and vulnerable people, revealing both God's power and God's compassion. And yet it's here, at this moment of extreme danger, when the disciples perceive most clearly who Jesus is. And this passage reveals something, I think, deeply true about us humans. I know at least that I have often overlooked God's presence in the peaceful and pleasant portions of my life, yet called out in earnest when things took a difficult turn. I'm not totally sure why this is, but I think part of it is that we spend a fair amount of our time and energy trying to establish a stable, safe, and secure life, both for ourselves and for those we love. And there's nothing wrong with that on one level. But in building that life, finding some success, it's easy to assume we no longer need God or forget how much we depend on God, until tragedy strikes in the form of an illness or a job loss or the end of a relationship or some grave mistake we've made. And suddenly our ongoing need for God becomes painfully clear. But the story doesn't only tell us about ourselves. It tells us two truths about God. First, no matter what it is that reminds us of our need for God, still God responds. And just as Jesus reassures the disciples and reaches out to grab hold of Peter, in the same way God responds to us with compassion and support. Second, and maybe even more importantly, God not only responds to our need, but actually desires that we seek to live lives of abundance and courage. Notice that Jesus actually commanded the disciples to cross the sea to go ahead of him, trusting them to navigate both the sea and the storm. Jesus offers a threefold response to the disciples. First, he urges them to take heart. Second, he reveals his presence with, among, and for them. For while we translate what Jesus says as "it is I," the Greek is a little more succinct and significant and translates it "I am," or says "I am." I suspect that both the disciples and Matthew's audience would hear the divine name, the divine "I am," pronounced in that. Third, having revealed his presence and identity, Jesus then encourages the disciples once more to leave fear behind and live what Brené Brown calls wholehearted lives. In fact, the root meaning of the English word courage is the Latin cor, and the French coeur, or heart, which may explain why English translations vary between take heart and take courage. And I think God still wants that for us. God desires, that is, that we trust that God is with us and for us, and out of that trust live with courage and hope, taking chances, risking ourselves in relationship, working for the good of the individuals and community around us, all the while remembering that even when we overlook God's presence, God is always there, sometimes to encourage us to overcome our fears, sometimes sending us out ahead, and sometimes reaching out to grab hold of us in forgiveness and mercy and comfort and grace. God promises to be with us in the difficult part of our lives, responding to our fears and cries for help, with the promise of God's presence and comfort. But God desires more for us, has hopes and dreams for us, both as individuals and as a community of faith. God is encouraging us to cross rough waters and even to step out of the boat in faith, trusting that God is there to grab hold of us in need. God calls us to wholehearted lives of courage and hope. See you soon.